Welcome back, everybody, to Ravenstar's Witching Hour. I'm your host, Solaris BlueRaven. I have some wonderful guests tonight as we've been talking. Jeff Wilson has joined us, and Jason Jarrell is my co-host tonight. And I must say, it's very impressive to have you on tonight, Jeff. And, of course, Jason, it's always a pleasure to have you on board with me.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, you do a great job. And
I appreciate the invite.
Oh, I'm telling you, I have to have you on my show, Hyperspace at KCOR. I'm going to have to drag you over there, too. I know the listeners are really enjoying it. We have a bunch of questions in chat as well. And I didn't let you finish there. If there's something you wanted to finish up with before we hit the break.
Sure. I was just saying that, one of the things that I have sort of this running joke with my UFO researcher friends is that when they go out to investigate a UFO report, they're writing down some eyewitness statement, and there's really not much evidence, generally speaking, other than an eyewitness statement. But crop circles are different. They're, out there in the field. They're tangible things that you can go out there and touch and feel on. But that, in another sense, what you're looking at when you look at a crop circle is really you're seeing the trace of whatever made the crop circle. The crop circle is really, in some sense, an absence of form. Crop circles are another way of thinking about it. Crop circles are an unform. They're created from the space that's left behind.
Mm-hmm. Like an after image?
Yeah. And so, oftentimes people, almost like a Rorschach test, they project meaning onto them because they're so strongly conditioned by society, to try to resolve it. You gave me a bunch of compliments about interpreting, crop circles and trying to decode them. But you have to be extremely careful when you do that because your perception can be colored by that, conditioning that you've received. That's why I go back to that idea about maybe that crop circles are perhaps without paradigm because they seem not to fit into any of the conditioning rules that society wants to place on us. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned, think about things in multidimensional ways. One of our early ICCRA members, a guy by the name of Gene Thomas, he wanted to rename crop circles. He didn't want us to use that term anymore. He wanted to call it MSIs, which in his term stood for multidimensional structured impacts, because that's what he, basically viewed them as.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Well, that's kind of what I see them as, too. Very, very fascinating. Wow, what a topic. Any questions, Jason?
Just for Jeffrey. Jeff, you've told me on different occasions a story about some musical notes. Yeah. That's another aspect of crop circles that one can study. Back in the early 1990s, there was a professor at Boston University by the name of Dr. Gerald Hawkins. You may be familiar with that name because he wrote a book back in the 60s called Stonehenge Decoded. Dr. Gerald Hawkins was the guy that found all the astronomical alignments encoded at Stonehenge. He basically invented the field of archaeoastronomy. Mm-hmm. And by the 1990s, crop circles had caught his attention, and he had discovered that mentions of many crop circle formations, ones that had multiple circles associated with the design, that you could take some of the outer smaller circles.
What happened here? We just lose Jeff? You still there, Jason?
I'm still here. It sounds like we lost Jeff.
Okay, let me call him back.
Hello?
Hi there. Did we lose you, Jeff, for a second?
I guess.
Yeah, you dropped for a minute there. Okay, you're back. We're live.
So I was mentioning that Hawkins was measuring the dimensions of different circles in a given crop circle formation. He would take the smaller number sized circles and divide them into the major circle dimension. And what he found was that you could get a ratio, a mathematical ratio, but those ratios were very specific ratios. They were diatonic ratios. Diatonic ratios are the same ratios as the white keys on a musical keyboard, so C to D, D to E, E to F, that kind of thing. And many crop circles that we have looked at in the United States incorporate those elements that there are essentially musical notes that you can decode. I mentioned that crop circle in Adams County that had a number of circles associated with that, and there were a number of diatonic ratios involved with those crop circles. So you would have the musical note E and G and D and F at various frequencies that you could calculate. If anybody is interested in viewing that, you can go out to YouTube. I uploaded a video years ago. If you just type in diatonic ratios, crop circles, you'll get this one from the Serpent Mound crop circle and the one from Miamisburg that I mentioned before. And you'll see my colleague Ted Robertson playing those musical notes on a harpsichord. So it's an interesting way to think about crop circles, a fundamentally different way, and again, contains information that you would not ordinarily understand. And so, you don't necessarily get like a melody or something like that, but what it's really is an unordered collection of pitches. So we call that a pitch class set. In understanding, music of crop circles would be, spread across several octaves to get those different frequencies.
Interesting, but it's not a harmonic.
No, no, you wouldn't necessarily call it a harmonic.
Okay, very interesting. Wow, that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
Very neat, right there. We did have a few questions in chat right here, and you were touching on the ley lines here, but this is from Benny. Can you ask if he thinks ley lines are a protective planetary energy system? Curious what his thoughts are on that. I know you kind of touched on the ley lines, but you want to elaborate any?
I would defer to Paul Devereaux again. I'm not an expert on ley lines, but Devereaux is, and Devereaux would say there's no definition of what they are. So
okay. Very good. And we have another one from Allah here. It says, ask a guest what he thinks of the crop circles, man-made or non-man-made. I guess he wants a little more elaboration on that.
So, sure. There are certainly crop circles that are being made by people, and you can see that in evidence all over the place. We have seen them here in the United States, but on a much lower level than what they're seeing in England, for instance. I think generally most of the researchers I know that have come from England that started studying crop circles early on will tell you that they have a really bad hoaxing problem in England. A huge percentage of the crop circles over in England are man-made.
Oh, that's a shame.
But I would say over the past 20 years or so, about 1 out of every 5 that we've looked at here in the U.S. turns out to be man-made. 1 out of 5 turns out to be not man-made. And then the other 60%, the other 3 out of 5, we just don't get enough information collected in time to make a determination one way or the other. They sort of fall into the undetermined class.
Mm-hmm. And you also have had people... go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, you have actually had people who have witnessed these things being formed right before their eyes, right?
Yeah, I investigated a crop circle. Probably the most recent eyewitness dates back a while, but back in 2003, summer 2003, there was a crop circle up in Wisconsin that was eyewitnessed by a gentleman by the name of Art Rentala. And he got up early in the morning. He was sort of conditioned. He was recently retired truck driver, and he was sort of a weather aficionado, and got up early on the 4th of July, turned on the TV and saw, Weather Channel, and saw that there was going to be a big storm front moving across his area. So he went out to his workshop, started brewing some coffee and sat there by the window to watch the storm front go past. And his workshop sort of was perched on the top of a hill. And there was a small valley that went down that hill, and then the valley came back up on the other side. And there was a wheat field across the street. And as the storm front moved in, his attention was caught by, the kind of the amber waves of grain, floating in the with the wind. And he was astonished to watch, one crop circle get swirled down, then a second one, then a third one, all three in the span of about 12 seconds. No unusual lights, no unusual sounds, just the passage of that storm front. And there have been about 50 or so documented eyewitness events of people watching crop circles form. I mentioned Dr. George Terrence Meaden earlier on in the program. He was the first one to really document any. He documented a whole number of them over in England. And they generally say about the same thing, that they form, in less than 30 seconds and, generally without unusual lights and sounds.
That's amazing. And you mentioned the storm front, which I find interesting. So that's twice now. There seems to be some kind of a storm front or something with a correlation between that and creating them. Wouldn't you say, or no?
Yep. Yeah, I would say that it happens more often than that.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Very interesting.
Jeff, do you feel like these crop circles are, for lack of a better term, are they the footprint of an event that we simply cannot detect?
I think that's a reasonable way of looking at them. We don't understand what the energy is that's making them. No, there hasn't been a thorough enough study with enough kind of instrumentation to be able to understand what that is. So your explanation kind of holds at this point. Perhaps with better technology and more people looking at them, we might be able to discern what that is. But right now, I would say that's a fair statement.
That's a good question, Jason, by the way. Very well said. Very interesting.
Well, I'm curious. You mentioned earlier that they seem to occur at various earthworks and mound sites. And just by the nature of the work that I do, I find that to be fascinating. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I have a sort of a hypothesis about that. My sense of the crop circles is obviously evolved over time and continues to evolve as new information comes in. But if we go back to one of the questions that Solaris asked me about the sort of nature of the context in which crop circles form, with down at the bottom of a hill, near water, near power lines, what you're seeing there is conditions that are set up in the landscape where you have generally an imbalance of electrical charges in the landscape. So you can go out and measure from the top of a hill to the bottom of a hill, and you'll find that the natural electric charge is different. And as you have running water, what happens is running water will strip ions from whatever, is, whether it's the stream bed channel or, if it's an aquifer, it's going through, the limestone. And it's changing the electrical charge of the landscape a bit. And then when you have power lines thrown in the mix, huge charges running through there and transformer boxes nearby, what you have is a system, a local system that's set up where you have all these charge imbalances. And I think what happens, and my best sense of it, is that all it takes is some kind of trigger to cause a cascade of those charge imbalances to rebalance. So as a storm front, for instance, passes by, or even, a microfront could probably trigger it, you get a cascade of electricity that that gets sent through the system and tries to rebalance itself. Well, part of the reason I think that perhaps that Native Americans were building their earthworks where they were building them is that, and why we find crop circles, showing up in the landscape around where Native Americans have built, earthworks, is that, in ancient times, you don't have sort of our modern landscape of power lines everywhere, and we're constantly inundated by, computers and TVs and radio waves and, all that stuff. And we've kind of become immune almost to the feeling of those changes in the landscape. But I would believe that, generally speaking, ancient peoples probably, as they're going through the landscape, if they encountered something like that, they could feel it more readily than we would today. And so they would, say, hey, there's something different about this place. There's something special about this place. Maybe we should, build a monument here. Or, maybe it was some part of an ancient technology of sorts, to be able to try to, amplify, electrical charges in the landscape. I think that might be part of the relationship, as to why you're seeing the two, kind of coincide.
Mm-hmm. That's a good answer.
That's just a hypothesis, right?
What would create a radioactive signature at a crop circle or on a site?
That is a mystery, and we've actually tried to discern, what could be the, radioactive isotopes that would be generating that radioactivity. I can say that probably the most extensive, work that was done in that area was by Michael Korost and Marshall Dudley. Marshall Dudley was at Oak Ridge Labs back in the early 90s, and he was responsible for analyzing the radioactive radiation that was being picked up through their study. Korost and Dudley they did a study of a number of crop circles in England and picked up radiation like our group has. But they had more sophisticated equipment at Oak Ridge Labs than what we have, and they determined 13 different possible radionuclides. And I've talked with Marshall Dudley in the past, and he stands by his work about that. But what our group has found is that, generally speaking, the half-life of that radiation, it doesn't last more than 10 days. And so there really isn't any radioactive isotopes that have a half-life of 10 days. We've actually seen, where we're detecting the radiation, and on the 10th day, it just goes back down to normal. From it.
Are you there?
Sounds like we lost him again.
Oh, darn it, man! Hang on there. It's just him, Jeff, or it's just him, Jason, not you.
Yeah, and it's always at the best part too.
I was like, damn. Get back.
Hello.
Hi there. We dropped you again. I don't know what's happening here, but continue on. Very interesting.
Yeah, crazy stuff. So, I had some discussions with W.C. Levengood about this specific thing, and we actually wonder if perhaps the changes to the electric field inside the crop circle could somehow be making the detectors for radiation more sensitive than they should be for ionizing radiation. That there's something about the nature of those fields that were changing what we actually were picking up, perhaps. And we don't know for sure. We'd have to do a whole bunch of tests about that, but we just don't really have a good explanation for it right now.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting.
I would say, though, that the radiation that we're picking up is nothing that's really dangerous. Mm-hmm. We're talking about, something on the order of, 10 to 20% above the background level that we, get every day. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty slight, but it's statistically significant.
Mm-hmm.
Jeffrey, I was wondering if I could ask you, from a purely theoretical standpoint, with all of your research, would you be more inclined to lean towards an explanation for this phenomenon as independent intelligences or entities interacting with the landscape, or could this be something that leans more towards the Jungian paradigm of a sort of a natural process that we simply don't understand?
That's a great question, and we could probably spend the rest of our time talking about that question. What I would say is that there's evidence for both of those approaches, and actually maybe two or three others. What I think I've found over time is that, everybody wants to have the one answer to explain all crop circles. And I think what I found over time is that there may be multiple sources that are causing crop circles. There's not perhaps just one full answer. To go down the first path that you talked about in terms of are there other intelligences, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is a number of years ago, I was on a business trip out to San Francisco, and while I was out there at the Noetic Sciences Institute, have you ever heard of the Noetic Sciences Institute?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Well, there was going to be a woman there that was going to be giving a lecture about crop circles, so I was interested. Her name was Dr. Fariba Bagzaran. She's a Persian woman. She was at one time the director of sleep studies at Stanford. And she was interested in lucid dream states. I don't know if you know what lucid dream states are, but it's basically the state of consciousness that you get where you know that you're dreaming, mm-hmm. right? You have sort of a conscious awareness that you're in a dream state, and that you have some ability to change the course of events in your dream while you're conscious about it. And she was interested in that level of consciousness. And so one of the things that she found was that in the early part of the 20th century, there was an art movement that was made up of artists who were dedicated to painting what they saw in their lucid dream states. And she tracked down one of these artists. He was in his 90s at the time, and his name was Gordon Onslow Ford. And Gordon Onslow Ford painted these amazing paintings. They're almost like cosmic-looking paintings with like stars and things, but they also have these interesting geometries that are based on the circle, the line, and the dot, not unlike a lot of crop circle geometries. And she was working with Gordon Onslow Ford, and around 1990, 1991 or so, a friend of hers sent her a picture of one of the early crop circle, what they call pictograms, basically, two circles connected by a pathway with a couple of geometric boxes next to it. And she showed that to Gordon Onslow Ford, and he began to cry because he said that he recognized what that symbol was and that he'd been painting it all his life.
Wow.
That's what he was seeing in his lucid dream state. Now, she said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, all of the lucid dream artists, when they paint their paintings, they're told what to paint by these beings of light. And so there was another of the lucid dream artists that actually made a painting in the 50s that was dedicated to these other consciousness entities, and he entitled his painting The Circle Makers, because that's what they were telling them to paint.
Wow.
Now, there is a anthropologist by the name of Jeremy Narby. He's a French anthropologist. He wrote a very interesting book back in the 1990s. It was called The Cosmic Serpent. And Narby went to the Amazon jungle to study indigenous populations that really had no contact with the outside world. And one of the things that he noticed while he was on his anthropological observation, was that whenever people had some kind of problem, a sickness or whatever in the village, they would go to their medicine man, and their medicine man would go take themselves into a lucid dream state. And when they came out of that lucid dream state, they generally had the solution to whatever the person's problem was. But what Narby noticed that was really interesting was that in many cases, the solution to the person's problem was something that was beyond the cultural knowledge of the tribe, that they were receiving new knowledge from their lucid dream state. And so Narby asked a number of these medicine men, well, what's going on? And they said, well, when we go into our lucid dream state, we communicate with beings of light that live inside of a twisted vine, and they sing to us the answers to our questions.
Wow.
And he said, that's unbelievable. Can you make me a drawing of it? And so they created a whole series of paintings about what they were seeing. And he took those paintings with him back to his university in France, and he was showing them to a number of his colleagues. And one of his colleagues, a microbiologist, said, well, this painting right here, what you're looking at, is mitochondrial DNA.
Oh, wow.
Now,
Awesome.
What Narby postulated was, after he did a big study of DNA, was that DNA gives off light in the visible part of the spectrum.
Yep.
And DNA gives off sound in the audible part of the spectrum, and it's been recorded, and guess what? It sounds like music. And so what Narby indicated was that perhaps these shaman, these medicine men, were taking their consciousness down to the molecular level, and that there is some other type of consciousness that lives inside DNA that can give us, information that we don't actually, have firsthand knowledge of. Mm-hmm. Now, it's possible that perhaps this could lead us down the path that Jason was suggesting, that is there another consciousness involved? Mm-hmm. There have been a half a dozen or so sort of experiments by various crop circle groups, including ours, where people have tried to meditate on a particular given design to see if we could communicate with some other intelligence that might be able to, respond by producing that design. And the results have been mixed. Sometimes the designs show up but they're not exactly where you want them or when you want them, but they do kind of appear. Mm-hmm. And so, it's hard to know exactly what is going on there. Is there an element that, to at least some crop circles, whereby there might be some kind of human consciousness influence to them? That could be a possibility.
Yeah, or activating the DNA. What you were describing was very interesting, because it sounds like they're activating DNA through frequency, and of course accessing what I would call like the full Akashic almost, to me. Very interesting.
Right. Now, taking the second part of the question, the Jungian part of the question, Jung, of course, had a number of interesting sort of philosophical ideas. One being that, his paper that was written with the physicist Pauli, talking about synchronicity, right? Synchronicity being a meaningful coincidence of two or more events where something beyond the probability of chance is involved. Well, there appears to be plenty of examples of crop circle synchronicity that takes place. And I won't go into, a whole bunch of those. But Jung says that there is symmetry between spirit and matter. Right? He kind of goes into talking about the quaternity, and he describes the squaring of the circle, actually. And I mentioned the squaring of the circle before. Mm-hmm. But that quantum mechanics, seems to be involved and, can prove the existence of both states. According to Jung, that he describes, the transformation of potential being into actual being mm-hmm. through physical measurement is a part of that. And, that's one possible, avenue of looking at that. Another would be, when he talks about the squaring of the circle, Jung says that the squaring of the circle is one of the many archetypal motifs which form the basic patterns of our dreams and our fantasies. From the functional point of view, the squaring of the circle is called the archetype of wholeness. And that the quaternity that's related to that, the quaternity of the one, is the schema of all images of God, from the Bible, like Ezekiel or Daniel or Enoch or to Egyptian mythology, Horus with his 4 sons. That's the quaternity. And it's most often described as a motif of 4 as 3 and then 1 that's different. And it's described as having a dark half and a light half. But Jung had a particular patient that he had, he would have them do is, paint a series of paintings. Somebody was having some kind of mental, problem or whatever, he would say, paint painting. And then they would go off and paint a painting and they would bring it back to him and he would look at it and he would say, go paint another painting. And they would go off and they'd paint another painting and bring it back. And there would be this series of paintings, and through that series of paintings, their subconscious would transform. And in that process, once you got to a certain place, if you would end up painting lightning, for instance, and Jung would say that symbolically, lightning depicts an overpowering change in the psychic condition associated with the quaternity. And that's the transformative part of the process. Now, in that transformation, Mercurius, or the animal spirit, arises into the fire flash of existence. That's the divine essence of God, which Jung describes as being like a fiery serpent, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where the divine innermost birth of the soul takes place. They call that the libido stage of transformation, or the cinnabar stage of transformation. Now, cinnabar is an interesting word. In alchemy, cinnabar was equal to the Ouroboros dragon, or the dragon that eats its tail, that little circle. But in Latin, it's called the sanguis draconis, or the dragon's blood, right? Now, in alchemy, it's all about the philosopher's secret of the stone, right? So in the stone sleeps Mercurius, the animal spirit. But that spirit is also known as the round and the square. That's the squaring of the circle, right? Mm-hmm. It's also known as the circle of the moon. So what Jung would say is that when you start looking at these crop circles, a lot of the same symbolism is there. It's present. Whether that is its archetype that we're seeing show up, or these are, associated with energetic events that have imprinted themselves in human consciousness as part of our patterning, it's hard to know. But he does say that you will come to a turning point at some point in that process. But that turning point, the illumination of your consciousness, or the transforming of the fertilizing part, there is another entity that is involved, and that is the serpent. The snake is the necessary part of the process of growth. So he says, traditionally, the God of Revelation, that's little r, not big R from the Bible, but the God of Revelation has the form of a snake and calls it the agathodaimon, or the good daemon. Mm-hmm. And the good daemon is always pictured encircling the equal cross. That's the Celtic cross pattern, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what's really interesting about that is the agathodaimon was the, depending on which Greek myth you read, he was either the pupil or the teacher of Hermes, also known as Mercurius, the animal spirit, right? And to the Greeks, he was the guardian of the vines and the cornfields, right? Mm-hmm. So, no shock that we would see, perhaps crop circles, involved in farm fields. But you see these patterns repeat over and over and over again, and it's just an omnipresence practically when you go out and look at it.
Fascinating. I love the way you're describing this information. You teach classes, right? Or no?
I used to teach, but I don't teach
you're brilliant
right now.
I'll tell you point blank, I'm very impressed with you. I'll say it again. I don't want to embarrass you or anything, but I'm blown away by you. You're very intelligent. Really appreciate that.
I know that Jason is something of a Jungian scholar. Were you able to follow that? Did I accurately describe that?
Well, I've actually been studying Jung since my college years, and I actually had an invitation to go to the University of Noetic Studies when I was in college. And one of the things that really strikes a chord with me regarding the phenomena that you're describing and Jung is that Jung believed that underlying all human consciousness, there was this collective unconscious of symbolism and experience that we all had in common. And by the end of his life, he had actually concluded that it probably also existed in the natural world around us. Mm-hmm. So to see this symbolism and these concepts that are typically associated with the human mind also appearing in the natural landscape really reminds me a lot of Jung's writings.
Yeah, it's just to go back to another earlier concept that I talked about the undecidability that Jacques Derrida talked about. That is actually a very old concept that dates all the way back to the time of the Egyptians. And, I'm sure that you might be familiar with the Egyptian Thoth, right? Mm-hmm. And his father, the sun god Amon. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a really interesting aspect to Thoth that most people don't really pay much attention to. There's a story where Thoth presents his invention of writing to his father, King Amon, the sun god. And Amon determines that writing is a pharmakon. Have you ever heard of that term, pharmakon? Mm-hmm. Pharmakon is a Greek word. It's been translated variously as like a magic potion, but it's ambiguous. It means both cure and poison. It's both good and bad. It has both good and bad aspects. And so King Amon determines that writing is a pharmakon, and he rejects it because it has both a harm and a benefit. And he, has challenged his son to produce only beneficial things. And so Thoth, says that basically, he's sort of doomed to only invent pharmakons. He only invents things, pharmakons being undecidable, right? And I think that's maybe where crop circles fall into place, is that they fall into that category. They might be a pharmakon. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is, one of the dirty little secrets about crop circles that most people have no idea about is that they have done some damage to people and to animals over time. There are some, reports that animals have been just absolutely obliterated in crop circles. I investigated one here in Ohio about 4 or 5 years ago, in which a deer had been caught inside the area where the crop circle was formed, and it was literally just obliterated pieces all over the place. Wow. there were two reports both in Florida back in the 50s of two different men getting caught either adjacent to or inside of a crop circle forming, and both received burns. One guy was blinded for a while. The other guy had a bunch of burns on his chest. And there have been a number of crop circles associated with cattle mutilations. One of the largest reported crop circles in terms of sheer number, 48 circles in one event up in Minnesota back in the 70s. One of those circles had a cattle mutilation in it. And there have been other reports of cattle mutilations inside crop circles. So, in reports of animals, there was a fairly famous documented report up in Canada back in the early 1990s of a porcupine that was just kind of smashed flat and dragged around inside the crop circle through the process of, the crop circle forming. So, both cure and poison, perhaps, right?
Good or evil. Very interesting. Well, I didn't know they had the cattle mutilations correlated. I didn't realize that at all with the crop circles.
Yeah, people don't like to talk about those details.
Wow.
Crop circles are all supposed to be love and light, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's.
But people want to choose to ignore, all the details. Right?
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Well, that's an important detail, if you ask me. And like with anything else, with wisdom, knowledge, or technology, we have to be wise with it.
Right.
Versus the intent behind it. It makes me wonder if someone doesn't have pure intent, if it just gets corrupted, like some kind of a file. It's very interesting.
Jeff, this just makes me consider that maybe a lot of our limitations in understanding this just comes down to our dualistic perceptions.
Yes, very much so. I think, going back to Young and Wolfgang Pauli's paper, they talked about their research in quantum physics led them to a term that they sort of invented that they called it the irrepresentables, right? That they didn't even know how to quantify certain things because physics couldn't describe it, or psychology couldn't describe it either, coming from Young's point of view. And that common factor, though, between synchronicities and the quantum world led him to his concept of the unus mundus, right? The multiplicity of the empirical world that rests on some underlying unity, right? Mm-hmm. That's what Jason was talking about. Is what emerges out of that is the form of the archetype.
Mm-hmm. Right. We have another question here from Olive in the chat, real quick. He asks if the crop circles ever happen in the desert, where no grass crops.
Yeah, I've actually I investigated one in New Mexico in the desert about 6 or 7 years ago. I was on a business trip, and there happened to be a report in New Mexico, and I went out to investigate it. A couple of concentric rings, two sets of concentric rings in the desert. They happen in snow and ice. I've investigated ice circles before. Those are particularly difficult investigations because your evidence literally melts away into whatever lake it's on or whatever. But yeah, they're not just confined to farm fields. I would say more than a third of the crop circles that I've investigated over time have been in, pasture grass, for instance, not planted farm construction.
Very interesting. Jeff, have you ever brushed shoulders with the military-industrial complex while you were in the field researching crop circles?
Actually, yes, I have. I generally don't talk about it because I think it's just a diversion of the research. But yeah, that crop circle that was eyewitnessed by Art Rentala, for instance, we were in the process of investigating the crop circle in the field when the military showed up. And so, first they flew over in a helicopter a couple of times, and then we got visited by, uniformed personnel on the ground, took down our license plate numbers and walked around in the circle, and we talked to them for a little bit, and then they left. We've run into them in a couple of circles, but not often, not very often.
Doesn't sound too negative. Go ahead.
That's interesting. That's interesting that this is a phenomenon that we are continually assured by the establishment has no importance or value, and yet we have military personnel obviously interested in it.
Yeah, we tried to follow that up through the Freedom of Information Act. We wanted to, one of the things that the uniformed person asked us or told us was that he was assigned to a specific team that was to go out almost like a rapid response team to investigate crop circles. And he was based out of Scott Air Force Base, is what he said. And but he was on temporary assignment at an Air National Guard base in Milwaukee. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request at Scott Air Force Base, and they said you'd have to get clearance from the Secretary of Defense. At that time was Donald Rumsfeld, and they gave us Donald Rumsfeld's fax number specifically, and so we filed it with them. They came back to us and said, we don't have those records. You have to contact the Air National Guard base in Milwaukee. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Air National Guard base in Milwaukee, and they said you need to contact the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. His fax number is such and such. And we just got the runaround. No matter which way we tried, we couldn't get them to acknowledge, who had the record. So.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Well, considering your background and the way you access data and how your research in general is very impressive, as I said before, have you ever thought about, I know this is very theoretical, but the idea of crop circles existing off-world on different planets or their origin connected to that?
Yeah, I would imagine that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, how much we could track that, at any point in the future for the next century or two. But,
would you go to Mars if they asked you to? Let me ask you this.
Would I go to Mars?
Yeah, and research, explore, do what you're doing here. Would you go to another planet?
Yeah, probably. Well, at one time I probably would have. Now, probably not so much.
Okay.
But yeah, I had a big interest in planetology when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, you're definitely very expanded, both of you. And we're going to have about 10 minutes here, plus or minus, but I want to make sure that we give everybody a rundown insofar as how to contact you if they want to. And also, where are you both doing presentations soon? I know you were doing presentations.
I have one upcoming on Tuesday, the 9th. What is that? The 12th? Yeah, Tuesday the 12th. 2 days from now in Chillicothe, Ohio, at the Hopewell Culture National Park. I will be giving a lecture called "The Hopewell Heist," which is a very interesting story about how all of the hundreds of thousands of artifacts that were collected from the excavations of the Hopewell Culture site, the Hopewell Mound Group site in Chillicothe, how those artifacts were stolen at the end of the Chicago World's Fair, and one man's effort to track them down and return them. It's a great story.
Very interesting.
That's my upcoming lecture in a couple of days.
It's going to be a very good one.
I'll be doing some lectures after the publication of my book, and I'll be posting on Facebook where some of the locations and dates for those will be.
Excellent. And when's your book coming out?
Well, it's very soon. Our publisher is ready to crank it out finally, and we're just waiting to get some things in place. It shouldn't be very long.
It's going to be great. Well, when it goes live, you have to be back on the show to discuss it. So.
Well, Jeff's actually read it. He's like the one man on earth that's read the book.
All right.
Yeah, I think what is there, about 50 of my photos in your book.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's great.
So he has written what I would call a tour de force. It will be a book that people will be referencing for the next 6 decades, or more. It's going to be a landmark in the field, I think. It's a great book.
Yeah, I'm excited to read it.
That means a lot coming from you, Jeff.
Well, you have. You've taken on a subject that is rife with nonsense, and you have, tracked it down. You've gotten to the essence and the truth of it, I think. And I know you're still working on it, and you're still following up and going even deeper than you have in this book. But should we, mention the title?
Yeah, let's have it.
Mm-hmm.
His book is titled Ages of Giants.
I love it.
And so it's.
I'm looking
forward. Did I get that right, or is it Ages of the Giants? I should say.
It's Ages of the Giants, but we'll take what we can get.
That's great. I love it. I can't wait. Well, what about you, Jeff? Are you writing any new material or books or anything?
I will. I actually have several planned in the works. Probably one of the first will be a book about Serpent Mound. I've done a lot of research about Serpent Mound over the last decade, and stuff that people have not really heard before. And it's going to be a good one, I think. I will probably there'll be a series of smaller guidebooks that several authors are collaborating on, including myself, Jason, and an author by the name of Ed Grondine, and Fletcher Wilson, and Ross Hamilton.
Thanks.
We're all going to be collaborating on a series of guidebooks to a number of the ancient sites throughout the Midwest.
Well, that's going to be fantastic. Oh, I look forward to that one too.
Very nice. Jeff's kind of a humble guy. Let me just say that his research on the Serpent Mound is the best research ever conducted, and his book on the Serpent Mound is going to be the book on the Serpent Mound.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jason, and you are also very impressive as well, both of you. And I want to thank Jason. Jason is the one that actually had us connect, so I'm very, very happy that you did that, Jason. Thank you very much for co-hosting tonight, and also having Jeff on. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, you're just I can't say enough good things about you.
I was happy to talk about some of the deep research that we've done, and I know Jason and I have had a lot of deep conversations, particularly about the mounds and the earthworks, because we're both on similar trajectories with some of that stuff. So.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can see how it would be very complementary. There's no doubt about it. And I know you touched a little bit, and of course we don't have any time to talk about it, but you do talk about the Thunderbird and the Serpent connection. Is that going to be in your new book?
More than likely, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It will either be in the Serpent Mound book or a future book on crop circles, or perhaps both. Very interesting. Yeah. I have a connection to Thunder. If anybody's interested in seeing what that might look like, I think there is a lecture of mine on YouTube somewhere. I did a co-lecture with Ross Hamilton at a Megalithomania event where we did it about the Thunderbird and the Serpent. It was called The Return of the Thunderbirds. Very, very nice. Yeah. And do you have your own YouTube channel or no? I do. I guess I mentioned, we posted that video of Ted Robertson playing the musical notes.
Oh, that's right.
A handful of other videos up there if people want to see, like, for instance, a time lapse of one of the astronomical alignments at Serpent Mound. You can watch the equinox sunrise through the center coil, or things like that. Very nice. We're just about out of time here, about 2 minutes plus or minus. Jason, do you have anything you want to add before we close the show in a few minutes?
Well, I'd just like to add that it's always a real pleasure to come on this show and to speak to your audience, because this is the audience that wants the deep information, like Jeff said. And it's always also a pleasure to participate in something with Jeff, because we've done some conferences together before, and it's always a pleasure to meet a researcher with that type of medal. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Next time you guys are lecturing, I'd love to see both of you out there. I'll have to keep track of that. That'd be for certain. Very impressive. I'd like to see you do a documentary. That would be really nice also, both of you together.
Well, that sounds like a great idea.
Mm-hmm. Something down the road, you never know. And also, are they still doing the crop circles? I mean, insofar as crop circles being created in this timeline in 2017, are there still crop circles being created?
Yeah, I would imagine there are. There have been less and less reports in the last 5 years, and don't really know why that's the case, but they seem to be declining in terms of reporting of them. Okay. One of the interesting things that I have found is that some crop circles are showing up on Google Earth satellite imagery that have not been reported previously. So people are just not reporting them widely.
Okay, well, we're out of time here. And thank you, Jeff, so much for joining us. It's been wonderful. Jason, always a pleasure. Gentlemen, have a wonderful evening. Stay safe out there, everybody. Stay tuned for Shiny Side Out with David Dungeon coming up next. I'll tell you on tonight from Down Under, as they always do with their wonderful show. All right, everybody, please be safe in Florida. Good luck with all that weird rain and crazy hurricane. Thank you, gentlemen. It's been wonderful. Great.